The alarm screamed through the bridge before we even finished dropping out of faster-than-light travel. I had not heard that particular alarm in my 43 years of service to the Quenthari hegemony. It was the kind of sound that the engineers had programmed for a situation they never expected to happen. A signal detection alarm. Not the soft chime we heard when passing by known civilizations or catalogued relay stations. This was the deep, shaking roar that meant our sensors had encountered something massive, something structured, something that should not exist where we were going. I grabbed the edge of my console and looked at Keth, my pilot, who was already pulling up the sensor display with hands that were trembling. His wide amber eyes reflected the scrolling data on his screen, and I watched the color drain from his face. "Archivist Vaitsari," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. "We have a problem." I pushed myself out of my seat and crossed the bridge in 3 strides. Commander Dran was already standing behind Keth, his arms folded across his broad chest, his expression locked in the permanent scowl that I had grown used to over the past 8 months of this miserable assignment. Imari, our xenobiologist, was the last to arrive, still wiping sleep from her eyes as she stumbled through the bridge door. "What is it?" I asked, leaning over Keth's shoulder. He pointed at the screen. I looked, and for a long, terrible moment, I forgot how to breathe. The sensor display showed electromagnetic radiation. That was normal. Every star system produced background noise. But this was not background noise. This was structured, layered, dense. The signals were stacked on top of each other in hundreds of different frequencies, woven together with a complexity that made my stomach turn. There were communication signals, navigation beacons, data transmissions, energy signatures from industrial processes, and something else, something I could not identify, something that pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, almost alive. All of it was coming from the 3rd planet of this system, the planet we were here to check on, the planet that our records called Sol 3, the planet that the rest of the galaxy called nothing at all, because nobody cared about it. Earth. "That cannot be right," I said. My voice sounded foreign to me. "Run the sensors again." Keth ran them again. The results were the same. If anything, the readings were getting stronger as we moved deeper into the system. "Archivist," Dran said from behind me, his deep voice flat and controlled. "The last survey report on this world was filed 10,000 years ago. The species was classified as Category 9 primitive, stone tools, animal skins. Fire was their most advanced technology." He paused, and I heard him shift his weight. "These readings suggest a civilization operating at or above Category 3. I knew what Category 3 meant. We were Category 2. Category 3 was our level of technology with room to spare, and Category 9 was the lowest rating in the archive, reserved for species so primitive that they were not worth a second look. "Maybe the readings are wrong," Imari offered from behind us, though even she did not sound convinced. The readings were not wrong. I knew it in the deep part of my mind where instinct lives, the part that tells you when something fundamental has shifted beneath your feet. But I did not want to accept it, because accepting it meant that everything I had spent my career believing was built on a lie. I was the senior archivist of the Quenthari hegemony. I had dedicated my life to the archive, the greatest collection of knowledge in the galaxy. Every species, every world, every civilization, all catalogued and classified and filed away. The archive was supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to know everything, and the archive had told us, in clear and certain terms, that the creatures on Sol 3 were nothing. I had been sent here on a routine reassessment mission, the kind of boring work they assigned to archivists who were close to retirement. Visit a few forgotten worlds, confirm their classifications still held, file the paperwork and go home. My last 3 assignments had been to planets where the most advanced life form was a type of moss. Before that, a world of fish that had learned to climb trees. Thrilling work for a senior official of the galaxy's greatest empire. "Take us in closer," I said. Keth hesitated. "Archivist, protocol says we should report unusual findings before approaching." "Take us in closer, Keth." He did, and as we crossed the outer boundary of the system, past the frozen worlds and the gas giants, the signals grew louder and more complex. I watched the data scroll across our screens and felt something cold settle in my chest. This was not a fledgling civilization stumbling into its first radio transmissions. This was a mature, advanced, deeply rooted technological presence, the kind of thing that does not spring up in 10,000 years. Except, apparently, it had. Drawn pulled up the old survey file. I had read it before we departed on this mission, back when this was supposed to be a boring assignment. The file included footage captured by the original survey team, a group of Quenthari scientists who had visited Earth when its inhabitants were still living in caves. I had watched the footage and felt nothing. Small, fragile creatures with soft skin and no natural defenses, huddled around campfires, painting crude images on stone walls. The survey team had spent less than a day in orbit before marking the planet as irrelevant. The classification summary still glowed on Dran's screen. Sol 3, dominant species, bipedal mammalian, intelligence, emergent, tool use, rudimentary, threat assessment, none. Recommendation, no further observation required. No further observation required. That line had been written 10,000 years ago, and nobody had questioned it since. The hegemony had expanded across 1,000 star systems in that time. We had cataloged over 12,000 species. We had built an empire so vast that a message sent from one end took 3 years to reach the other. And not once, in all of that expansion, had anyone thought to look back at the small blue world in this quiet corner of the galaxy. Archivist, Imari said quietly. She had moved to her own station and was studying something on her screen with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It took me a moment to identify it. It was fear. I went back through the original survey data. There was a notation that the lead scientist flagged, but the review board dismissed. The species on Sol 3 had an unusually high adaptive variance score. Meaning what? Dran asked impatiently. Meaning their behavior was unpredictable. Most primitive species follow patterns. They develop along predictable paths. These creatures did not. Their social structures were chaotic. Their problem-solving methods were inconsistent but effective. The lead scientist wrote that it was, and I am quoting from the file, unlike anything observed in comparable species. She recommended a follow-up observation within 500 years. And the review board dismissed it, I said. They called it a statistical anomaly, a data error. The follow-up was never scheduled. I stared at the growing brightness of Earth's sun through the forward viewport. A single scientist, 10,000 years ago, had seen the warning sign and raised the alarm. And the institution I had devoted my life to had ignored her. It was not a data error, I said. We were close enough now to get visual confirmation, and that was when the second shock hit me. I had expected to see a planet. What I saw was a planet that had been transformed. Massive structures floated in orbit, catching the sunlight and gleaming like jewels scattered across black cloth. Ships moved between them, dozens of ships, in orderly patterns that spoke of traffic control systems and established routes. The planet itself was cloaked in a thin lattice of artificial satellites, and its moon, the single large moon that the original survey had noted, was different. Parts of its surface had been restructured. I could see the geometric precision of construction on a scale that I could not fully comprehend. Keth made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a whimper. Dran said nothing, but I saw his hand move to the console, where our communication systems were controlled, and I knew he was thinking about sending a distress signal back to the hegemony. Do not transmit anything, I said sharply. Not yet. We need to understand what we are looking at before we start a panic. He was right, and the full weight of that realization was still settling over me when Keth's console chimed with a new alert. A different kind of alert. An incoming communication. "Archivist," Keth whispered. "They are hailing us." The bridge went silent. I could hear the hum of our ship's engines. I could hear Amari's breathing. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast and desperate in my ears. A Category 9 species was not supposed to detect a Quinthari survey vessel. Our ships were designed to be invisible to anything below Category 4. But these beings had found us the moment we entered their system, and now they were knocking on our door. I straightened my back. I smoothed the front of my uniform. I reached for the console with a hand that I forced to remain steady. "Open the channel," I said. The sound that filled our bridge was a voice speaking in a language I did not recognize, but our translator caught it within seconds and converted it to Quenthari. The voice was calm. It was clear. It carried no trace of surprise, no hint of alarm. It sounded, more than anything, like a professional doing a routine job. Please identify yourself and state your purpose. Welcome to Earth. I looked at Amari. I looked at Keth. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The creatures we had dismissed as primitives, the small, fragile, soft-skinned beings who had once painted on cave walls, were welcoming us home to a world we never should have forgotten. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like a blade pressing against my throat, that we had made the worst mistake in the history of the hegemony. We had turned our backs on something we did not understand, and whatever it had become in our absence, we were about to find out. My voice did not shake. I would not allow it to shake. Sol System Harbor Authority. This is Archivist Vatari Solon, of the Quinthari Hegemony, Survey Division. Then Officer Claire Ashton laughed. It was a short, warm sound, full of something I could not name. Classification audit, she repeated. I cut the transmission and looked at my crew. Nobody spoke for a long time. So, Imari finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Who wants to tell the hegemony?" Nobody answered. I had never responded to a hailing signal with my hands shaking before. In 4 decades of service, I had faced hostile environments, navigated collapsing jump corridors, and once survived a hull breach that should have ended my career, along with my life. None of those moments had frightened me the way Claire Ashton's calm, professional voice frightened me, because those other dangers were things I understood. This was something I could not even begin to process. Keth followed the approach coordinates that the Harbor Authority had sent us, and with every passing minute, the situation grew more impossible. Our sensors were overwhelmed. They had not been designed for this. They had been built to scan primitive worlds, to count campfires and track migration patterns. Now they were trying to process a civilization that was operating on a scale our instruments could barely measure. The orbital platforms grew larger as we approached. They were enormous. Each one was a city in its own right, with docking bays that could swallow our survey vessel 10 times over. I counted at least 40 of them forming a loose ring around the planet, connected by transit lines that pulsed with energy. And between them, ships moved in constant streams, small shuttles, medium transports, and further out, in higher orbits, I could see the shapes of vessels that made my stomach drop. Heavy armor plating, oversized engine housings, weapons arrays that my sensors could not fully analyze because the energy signatures were unlike anything in our database. These ships were massive, some of them 3 or 4 times the size of the largest Quinthari cruiser in our fleet, and they were just sitting there, parked in orbit like they had nothing to prove. Archivist, Dron said, and for the first time since I had known him, his voice carried something other than arrogance. Those vessels. Their power output alone exceeds anything we have. I can see that, Commander. If they decided to use those weapons on us, we would not even have time to send a final transmission. I can see that too. He fell quiet after that. The realization of total helplessness was new to Draden. He was a military officer who had spent his career operating under the assumption that the Quinthari hegemony was the dominant force in the galaxy. Every training exercise, every strategic doctrine, every tactical model he had ever studied was built on that assumption. And now, watching human warships drift past our tiny survey vessel like mountains passing a pebble, that assumption was dissolving in front of his eyes. Keth guided us through the traffic with the careful attention of someone who understood that one wrong move would matter. The Harbor Authority was tracking us, sending gentle course corrections through our navigation system as if herding a lost animal back to its pen. I tried not to think about what that implied. They had access to our navigation system. They could interface with our technology. A species that we had classified as Category 9 had learned to speak to our machines. We docked at one of the orbital platforms. The process was smooth and mechanical, and I noticed that the docking clamps adjusted themselves to fit our ship's unusual hull shape without any apparent difficulty. Adaptive infrastructure. Technology that reconfigured itself to accommodate the unknown. The hegemony had nothing like it. Our docking systems required visiting ships to match our specifications. The humans built systems that adapted to match the visitor. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes about the difference in philosophy between our civilizations. Amari was the first one to the airlock. She had been quiet during the approach. Her eyes locked on her scanner readings, and I could see from the way she moved that she was operating on adrenaline and scientific curiosity in equal measure. Dron positioned himself behind me, his hand resting on the sidearm he carried more out of habit than necessity. I gave him a look, and he moved his hand away. Whatever was about to happen, drawing a weapon would only make it worse. The airlock opened, and we stepped onto the station. The air was clean and slightly warm, with a faint scent that I later learned was a combination of recycled atmosphere and something the humans called coffee. The corridor was wide and well lit, with smooth walls that displayed information in a language I could not read. But beneath the text, I noticed smaller lines in other scripts. Some of them I recognized. They were the written languages of species we had catalogued, other primitive worlds the hegemony had dismissed long ago. The signage was multilingual, and not all the languages were human. That detail stopped me cold. Multilingual signage meant regular visitors from multiple species. It meant established relationships, trade routes, diplomatic connections, all built without the hegemony's knowledge. How long had this been going on? How many of the species we had classified and forgotten had found their way here? We passed a viewport, and I made the mistake of looking through it. The view showed the interior of the station's main docking ring, and I counted over 60 ships of various sizes and designs, berthed alongside each other. Some were clearly human. Others belonged to species I could not identify. One vessel, sleek and dark, bore markings that my translator could not parse, symbols from a language that had never been entered into the hegemony's linguistic database. There were entire civilizations docking at this station that we did not even know existed. Keth noticed me staring. "Archivist," he said quietly, "I have been running scans since we docked. The station's power grid alone produces more energy than our 3 largest military installations combined, and this is just one of 40 platforms." I nodded and kept walking. There was nothing I could say. The numbers spoke for themselves, and they were screaming. A delegation was waiting for us at the end of the corridor. 5 humans, standing in a loose formation that suggested practiced diplomacy rather than military discipline. They were smaller than I expected. The tallest among them barely reached my shoulder. Their bodies were soft, unarmored, without the natural defenses that most spacefaring species developed over millennia. No claws, no dense bone plating, no venom glands, no electromagnetic sense organs. They looked, by every biological standard I knew, like prey animals. Fragile things that should have been eaten by something bigger long before they ever looked up at the stars. And yet here they were, standing in a space station they had built, surrounded by ships that could destroy us, greeting us with the patient confidence of a species that had nothing to fear. The one in front stepped forward. He was middle-aged by their standards, with short brown hair and lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. He extended his hand, and my translator supplied the gesture's meaning before I could ask. "Archivist Vetari Solon," he said. "I am Simon Ward, Senior Ambassador for the Earth Diplomatic Corps. We have been expecting you." That sentence hit me harder than any weapon could have. I took his hand and shook it, a gesture that felt strange and intimate, direct physical contact with a member of another species. His grip was firm, his palm was warm, and his eyes, when I met them, held a steadiness that I recognized. It was the look of someone who had already played out this conversation in their mind 1,000 times and was ready for every possible direction it could take. "You have been expecting us," I repeated. "We have been monitoring Quinthari communication channels for approximately 300 years, Simon Ward said, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "When your survey division scheduled a return visit to Sol 3, we picked up the transmission. We had about 4 months' notice, plenty of time to prepare." 300 years. They had been listening to us for 300 years, and we had not known. We had been broadcasting our plans, our fleet movements, our political discussions, and the inhabitants of a planet we had written off as irrelevant had been sitting quietly, listening to every word. Dran stiffened beside me. I could feel his anger building, not because the humans had done something wrong, but because the implication was devastating. If they had been listening for 3 centuries, they knew everything about us, our strengths, our weaknesses, our internal conflicts. They had been studying us the way we once studied them, except they had done a far better job of it. Learning that someone has been watching you is unsettling. We know the feeling better than most. The words were gentle, but the implication cut deep. They had been watched once. By us. They had not forgotten how it felt. And now the positions were reversed. Why? I asked. It was the only question that mattered. You had our communication frequencies. You had 300 years. Why did you never make contact? Simon Ward's smile shifted. It did not disappear, but it changed into something deeper, something that carried the weight of generations of deliberation behind it. Because we were not ready, he said, and because we wanted to understand who we would be talking to before we started the conversation. Every step revealed something new that contradicted everything the archive had told me about this species. The station was populated by humans of every description, tall and short, dark and light, moving with purpose through corridors that hummed with technology I could not identify. But they were not alone. I saw other species walking among them. Some I recognized from the archive. Others I did not. A pair of aquatic beings moved through a transparent tube that ran parallel to the corridor, their fluid-filled environment separated from the breathable air by just a few inches of engineered material. "You have other species here," I said, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. "We have many friends," Simon replied without turning around. He led us to a conference room with a wide window that looked out over Earth. The planet filled the view, blue and green, and swirled with white clouds, and I stood there staring at it, while Simon gave us time to absorb what we were seeing. I had studied the original survey images. 10,000 years ago, the planet had been beautiful but wild, its continents dark at night, its oceans untouched. Now the continents were still green, still wild in many places, but I could see the subtle signs of a civilization that had learned to build without destroying. Cities glittered along coastlines, connected by transport networks that left the surrounding landscape intact. Forests covered areas that the original survey had shown as barren. The original survey noted significant ecological damage from early industrial activity, deforestation, pollution, ocean degradation. But this is restoration on a planetary scale. But we decided early on that there was no point in reaching for the stars if we destroyed the place we came from. Tell me, I said. She pulled up her scanner and showed me the bio readings she had taken of the humans in the delegation. I stared at the data and felt the floor shift beneath me. They have modified their own genetic code. They have eliminated most of the diseases that limited their ancestors. Their neural architecture has been augmented with cybernetic interfaces that allow direct communication with their technology. And their cognitive processing speed is approximately 3 times what the original survey measured. They took the biological platform they were born with, the same fragile, short-lived, physically weak bodies that the original survey team dismissed, and they turned it into something else entirely. They kept the adaptability, the unpredictability, the emotional range that makes them unique. But they removed the limitations. They are not the same species we catalogued. They are something new. I looked back at the window, at the planet that should have been a footnote in the archive. 200-year lifespans, genetic engineering, neural augmentation, orbital megastructures, a fleet of warships that dwarfed our own, and they had done it all in 10,000 years. A span of time that the hegemony had spent doing little more than expanding sideways across the galaxy, repeating the same patterns on world after world. These creatures had started with nothing. They had started with rocks and fire and painted walls, and they had turned themselves into something that the archive had no category for. Its hull caught the light of the sun, and threw reflections across the station's windows. Through the glass, I could see human technicians working on an adjacent platform, moving with easy confidence in their environment, laughing, talking, living their lives in a world they had built from nothing. I opened my personal tablet and pulled up the old survey file. The footage was 10,000 years old, grainy and distorted by time. Small eyes, flat features, a look of curiosity that I had dismissed as meaningless the first time I watched it. "What are you?" I whispered to no one. The footage kept playing. The human kept shaping its stone. Outside, the warship kept floating in the light of a sun that had watched 10,000 years of impossible transformation. And I sat there, the senior archivist of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy, and realized that I did not have an answer. I called it necessary because I needed to see with my own eyes what this planet had become. Sensor data and orbital views could only tell me so much. I needed to stand on their ground, breathe their air, and understand how a species we had thrown away had managed to build all of this. The shuttle ride down was smooth and fast. Human engineering, I was learning, prioritized elegance in ways that Quenthari technology did not. Our ships were powerful but blunt, designed for function with little regard for the experience of the beings inside them. Theirs were refined. The shuttle did not rattle or groan as it cut through the atmosphere. It descended in a gentle curve, and the view through the windows shifted from the blackness of space to the deep blue of sky, and then to green. So much green. That was the first thing that struck me as we dropped below the cloud layer. The continent beneath us was covered in forest, vast stretches of woodland that rolled across hills and valleys like a living carpet. Rivers wound through the landscape, glinting silver in the sunlight. I could see wildlife moving in clearings, and flocks of birds rising from treetops in spiraling patterns. The original survey noted that this continent had lost over 40% of its forest cover to industrial activity, Imari said, her voice hushed with something close to reverence. She was reading the old data on her tablet, comparing it to what we were seeing. They have reversed all of it. The biodiversity readings I am getting are higher than the original pre-industrial baseline. They did not just restore the ecosystem, they improved it. How? I asked. Simon, who was sitting across from us, leaned forward. It was not easy, and it did not happen overnight. About 300 years ago, we made a collective decision. We realized that our survival depended on the health of our planet, so we moved most heavy industry off-world, into orbital facilities and lunar installations. We redesigned our cities to work with natural systems instead of against them. We used genetic engineering to restore species that had gone extinct, and to strengthen ecosystems that had been damaged. He paused. It took 5 generations of sustained effort, but we got there. 5 generations. The Quenthari had held our empire for over 800 generations, and in that time, we had stripped dozens of worlds down to bare rock. We extracted what we needed and moved on, leaving dead husks behind us. It was efficient. It was practical. And standing in this shuttle, looking down at a planet that a younger species had chosen to heal instead of consume, it suddenly felt like the most short-sighted thing I had ever been a part of. We landed near a city. I use the word loosely because it did not look like any city I had seen before. There were no towering blocks of metal and glass crowding against each other. Instead, the structures were integrated into the landscape. Buildings rose from the ground like natural formations, their surfaces covered in living plants. Walkways wound between them, shaded by trees and lined with gardens. Water features ran through the public spaces, and I could hear birdsong even in the middle of what Simon told me was a population center of 4 million people. 4 million, Dron repeated, looking around with an expression that was struggling to find something to criticize. Where are they all? Underground, in orbital habitats, working remotely, or simply spread out, Simon said. We learned a long time ago that stacking people on top of each other creates problems, so we designed our cities to breathe. We walked through the streets, and the humans we passed paid us little attention. A few curious glances, a child who pointed and waved, a shopkeeper who nodded in greeting. No fear, no hostility, no sense that 4 aliens walking through their city was anything remarkable. I noticed a human and one of the insectoid beings from the station sitting together at an outdoor table, sharing a meal and conversation. It was so ordinary, so unremarkable to them, that it made my chest ache. The Quinthari did not share meals with other species. We did not sit at tables together. We catalogued them and moved on. Imari was in her element. She stopped to examine plants, to scan the air quality, to talk to a human gardener who was happy to explain the city's integrated water recycling system. The gardener, a young man named Philip, spent 20 minutes explaining how the root systems of specifically engineered trees filtered and purified water that was then channeled back into the city's supply. He was not a scientist, he was a gardener, and he understood the ecological engineering of his city with a depth and enthusiasm that would have impressed the senior scientists of the hegemony. Drawn walked in rigid silence, his eyes moving constantly, cataloging everything with the efficiency of a soldier assessing a fortified position. Keth stayed close to me, his nervousness obvious but controlled. After 2 hours of walking through the surface city, Simon led us to a transit station. We descended underground, and the character of our tour changed completely. Beneath the surface, the humans had built something that made the orbital stations look modest. Tunnels stretched in every direction, wide and well lit, connecting underground complexes that served purposes I could barely guess at. We passed through research facilities, manufacturing centers, data processing hubs, and agricultural installations that used artificial light to grow food in quantities that could sustain a population many times larger than Earth's current numbers. Insurance, Simon said, when I asked about the excess food production. We learned from our history. Famine was one of the great enemies of our early civilizations. We decided it would never threaten us again. We visited a medical facility where human doctors were treating patients from 3 different species. The equipment adapted to each patient's biology automatically, recalibrating its sensors and treatment protocols based on the species being examined. I watched a human physician consult with a colleague whose species I did not recognize. The two of them bent over a diagnostic display, discussing treatment options with the easy familiarity of professionals who had worked together for years. The physician noticed me watching and waved. "First time seeing a multi-species clinic?" she asked. "We do not have them," I said. "In the hegemony, medical treatment is species-specific. Separate facilities, separate protocols, separate priorities." She tilted her head, considering this. "That sounds lonely," she said, and then she turned back to her patient, leaving me standing in the corridor with a word echoing in my mind that I had never thought to apply to my civilization before. Lonely. The hegemony was lonely. We were surrounded by thousands of species, and we had made ourselves lonely. We visited an engineering workshop where a mixed team of humans and 3 other species were collaborating on what appeared to be an advanced propulsion system. They worked side by side, communicating in a blend of languages that their translation devices handled seamlessly. I watched a human woman and a tall reptilian being disagree about a design parameter, argue about it with passion and respect, reach a compromise, and immediately begin testing the new approach. No hierarchy, no classification, just minds working together. "How long have you been collaborating with other species?" I asked Simon. Some of them had been developing for thousands of years, just like us, growing in the silence your hegemony left behind. And you found them. But the real revelation came when Simon led us into a facility that was deeper than anything else we had visited. We took a high-speed elevator that dropped us several kilometers beneath the surface, and when the doors opened, I stepped into a chamber so vast that I could not see the far wall. The ceiling was lost in darkness above us, and the floor was covered in machinery that pulsed with an energy I had never encountered. "What is this?" I asked. A woman was waiting for us. She was tall, with dark skin and close-cropped hair, and she wore a simple uniform that carried no insignia of rank. Simon introduced her as Lucy Grant, director of the facility. "Dimensional folding," he said. "You cracked dimensional folding." Lucy nodded. About 80 years ago, the theory had been around for centuries, but the energy requirements were beyond anything we could manage, until we developed fusion cascade reactors. Once we had the power, the rest was engineering. Dimensional folding, the ability to compress space itself, to take 2 points that were light years apart and bring them together like folding a piece of cloth. The Quenthari had theorized about it 4,000 years ago. Our best scientists had worked on it for generations. And we had abandoned the research because the energy requirements were, as our physicists put it, fundamentally impossible to meet. The humans had met them. They had looked at the same impossible wall that our scientists had turned away from, and they had found a way through it. Not around it, not under it, but through it. And they had done it in less than a century once they had the right power source. A journey across the galaxy takes years. Dimensional folding is instantaneous, Lucy said. Or close to it. We can move from one side of the galaxy to the other in a matter of hours. Hours. The military implications alone were staggering, but it was the scientific achievement that stunned me. This was not a minor advancement. This was a leap so enormous that it redrew the map of what was possible. Lucy walked us through the facility, explaining the principles with the patient enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved her work. She showed us the containment fields that held the folding process stable, the navigation systems that mapped the dimensional intersections, the safety protocols that prevented the fold from destabilizing and tearing a hole in the fabric of space. It was meticulous, it was brilliant, and every minute I spent listening to her, the gap between what I had believed about this species and what they actually were grew wider. If they have this technology, our entire strategic position is worthless. Our fleets, our supply lines, our territorial control, all of it depends on the fact that space is big and travel takes time. If they can cross the galaxy in hours, they can be anywhere, everywhere. We cannot defend against that. I know, Commander. We need to leave. We need to report this immediately. Not yet. There is more I need to understand. I returned to Simon. We were alone now, standing near a window that looked out over the folding chamber. Lucy had taken Amari and Keth deeper into the facility, and Dron was pacing near the elevator, every line of his body radiating urgency. Ambassador Ward, I said, I need you to answer a question honestly. Ask? You have technology that surpasses ours. You have ships that could challenge our fleet. You have dimensional folding, which gives you strategic mobility that we cannot match. You have been monitoring our communications for 3 centuries. You know our strengths and our weaknesses better than we know them ourselves. I paused. Why have you stayed hidden? Why have you not used any of this? Simon looked at me for a long time. His expression was thoughtful, and in his eyes, I saw something that I had not expected. Sadness. Not for himself or his species, but for mine. Because we watched you, he said quietly. We watched the Kinthari for 300 years, Archivist. We saw how you expanded across the galaxy. We saw how you cataloged species and ranked them, and decided who was worth your attention and who was not. We saw the worlds you stripped bare and the civilizations you dismissed, and the knowledge you ignored, because it came from beings you considered beneath you. We could have demanded recognition, or trade agreements, or territorial rights. But we looked at the system you had built, and we decided we did not want to be part of it. Your hegemony is built on hierarchy, on the idea that some species are worth more than others. We wanted to build something different. Different how? I asked. Simon reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. He pressed it, and the air between us filled with light. A holographic map of the galaxy appeared, rotating slowly, every star system rendered in precise detail. But it was not the galaxy that stunned me. It was the markings. Every Quenthari system was highlighted, every fleet position, every resource depot, every communication relay, every hidden military installation that the hegemony believed was secret. The humans had mapped us completely. They knew where every ship was. They knew what every facility produced. They knew things about us that some members of our own High Council did not know. I stared at the map. It was beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful because of the sheer scope of the intelligence work it represented. Terrifying because it meant that at any point in the last 3 centuries, the humans could have struck at us, and we would never have seen it coming. You said you wanted to build something different, I said. What did you build? Simon smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been waiting a very long time to answer that question. We found the others, he said. The species you forgot. The ones you catalogued as primitive, and never looked at again. We found them. Archivist. Dozens of them. And we helped them. My legs felt weak. Helped them how? We shared knowledge. We offered technology when they were ready for it. On their terms. At their pace. We did not tell them what to become. We asked them what they wanted to be, and then we helped them get there. Some of them are now more advanced than you would believe. Others are still early in their development. But all of them are free, and all of them are growing. An alliance, I breathed. A coalition. Of the overlooked. Of the species that your archive dismissed as irrelevant. We call ourselves the Forgotten, because that is what you made us. You forgot about us, all of us, and in your absence, we found each other. The chamber was silent except for the low hum of the dimensional folding machinery. Dron had stopped pacing. He was standing perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled terror. He had heard every word. How many? He asked from across the room, his voice hoarse. Simon looked at him. The sadness in his eyes was still there, but now it was joined by something else. Something harder. Something that said the time for hiding was over. Enough, Simon said. We left Earth 2 days later. The humans did not try to stop us. There were no threats, no demands, no ultimatums. Simon Ward walked us back to our ship, shook my hand again with that same firm, warm grip, and wished us a safe journey. A species that does not try to prevent you from reporting their strength is a species that is not afraid of your response. The humans had shown us everything: their ships, their cities, their dimensional folding technology, their alliance of forgotten species, and then they had let us walk away. They wanted us to report back. They wanted the hegemony to know. The journey home took 11 days. 11 days of faster-than-light travel that now felt primitive and painfully slow, knowing that the humans could have crossed the same distance in hours. 11 days in which my crew fell apart in different ways. Dran retreated into military analysis, spending every waking hour compiling tactical assessments that grew more pessimistic with each revision. He ran scenario after scenario on his personal console, modeling possible conflicts between the hegemony's fleet and the human vessels we had observed. Every scenario ended the same way. Even without dimensional folding, the humans had enough firepower and strategic intelligence to cripple our military in a matter of weeks. With dimensional folding, they could do it in days. The question is not whether they could defeat us, Dran told me on the third day, his voice flat with exhaustion. The question is why they have not done so already. I did not have an answer for him, but the question itself told me something important. Dran was not a thoughtful man by nature. He was a soldier. The fact that he was asking why the humans had not used their advantage meant that even he recognized this was not a species that operated on the same logic as the hegemony. The Quinthari, in their position, would have struck long ago. The humans had chosen not to, and understanding why was going to be more important than any tactical assessment. Imari buried herself in data. She had collected more biological and environmental readings in 2 days on Earth than most xenobiologists gathered in a career. Her reports were meticulous and devastating. The humans had not just advanced their technology, they had advanced themselves. Their genetic modifications had eliminated hereditary diseases, extended their lifespans, enhanced their cognitive abilities, and improved their physical resilience. They had done all of this while maintaining the genetic diversity that made their species so adaptable in the first place. Most species that modify their own genome narrow themselves, Imari explained one evening, her tablet casting blue light across her face in the dim mess hall. They optimize for specific traits and lose the variance that allows them to adapt to new challenges. The humans did the opposite. They expanded their range while enhancing their baseline. They made themselves better at being unpredictable. That word again. Unpredictable. The same anomaly that the original survey team had flagged 10,000 years ago. The same data point that the review board had dismissed. And now I was sitting in a ship hurtling toward the capital of a galactic empire, carrying a report that would prove how catastrophically wrong that dismissal had been. Keth piloted in silence. He had not spoken more than a handful of words since we left Earth orbit. But on the 7th day, he came to me in the small cabin I used as an office. "Archivist," he said, standing in the doorway, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are we the villains in this story?" I looked at him. He was young, barely out of the academy, with wide amber eyes that still held the idealism that my years of service had worn away. He had joined the survey division because he believed in the mission. He believed in the archive. He believed that cataloging the galaxy was a noble pursuit, that knowledge was its own reward, that the hegemony's system of classification and hierarchy was based on genuine merit. And now he was asking me if we were the villains. "I do not know, Keth," I said, and for the first time in my career, honesty felt like a failure. He stood there for a moment longer, then nodded and left. I sat alone in the dim light of my cabin and thought about his question. In all the training I had received, in all the briefings and protocols and ethical guidelines that the hegemony had drilled into its officials, nobody had ever prepared me for the possibility that the system itself might be wrong. We had been taught that the archive was truth. That classification was justice. That hierarchy was the natural order of intelligent life. And now a young pilot who had spent 2 days on a planet of forgotten primitives was asking questions that the architects of our civilization had never bothered to consider. On the 9th day, we began receiving transmissions from the hegemony, and the picture they painted was worse than I had imagined. Other survey teams had been reporting anomalies from across the galaxy. Species that should have been primitive were showing signs of rapid advancement. Technologies were appearing on worlds where no technology should have existed. Communication networks were being detected where silence should have reigned, and at the center of every anomaly, buried in the data like a fingerprint, were traces of human contact. Humanity had not just been building quietly on Earth. They had been reaching out, for centuries, to every forgotten corner of the galaxy. Every species the hegemony had dismissed, every world marked as irrelevant, every civilization classified as too primitive to matter. The humans had found them all, and they had shared what they knew. The scope of it was breathtaking. This was not the work of a single generation or a single government. This was a project that had spanned centuries, coordinated across dozens of species and hundreds of star systems, all carried out under the nose of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. And we had never noticed. We had never even thought to look. We arrived at the capital world on the 11th day. The hegemony's seat of power was a planet called Kenthar Prime, and it had been the center of our civilization for over 2,000 years. Its cities were ancient and magnificent, its institutions revered across 1,000 star systems. I had spent most of my career here, walking the halls of the Grand Archive, filing reports, cataloging data, believing that the work I did mattered. Now, stepping off my ship onto familiar ground, everything looked different. The buildings were still tall, the streets were still crowded. The archive still stood at the center of the city, its spire reaching toward the sky. But I could not look at any of it without thinking about what I had seen on Earth. The High Council convened an emergency session. I had never addressed the council before. Archivists of my rank submitted written reports through channels and waited weeks for a response. But these were not normal circumstances, and the council wanted to hear from me directly. The chamber was vast, designed to impress and intimidate. 12 council members sat in elevated positions, arranged in a semicircle, looking down at me like judges at a trial. Chancellor Rethon presided from the highest seat, his ancient face carved with the deep lines of a being who had held power for longer than most species existed. I presented my findings. I spoke for 3 hours. I showed them the sensor data, the biological readings, the footage from the orbital stations and the surface cities, and the dimensional folding facility. I told them about the Forgotten Alliance, about the dozens of species that humanity had lifted and united. I told them about the map, the perfect intelligence picture that the humans had assembled of our entire civilization. I watched their faces as I spoke. Some of them tried to maintain their composure, others could not. One council member, a decorated admiral who had commanded fleets that conquered star systems, pressed his hand flat against the surface of his desk, as if to steady himself, when I showed the footage of the dimensional folding chamber. Another, a former colonial governor who had administered 20 worlds, closed her eyes when I described the Forgotten Alliance's membership numbers. The hardest moment was when I played the recording of Simon Ward saying, "We have been watching you the way you once watched us." Except, we paid closer attention. The silence that followed that sentence lasted longer than any I had experienced in my career. It was the silence of an empire hearing its own eulogy. The council listened through the rest in silence. When I finished, the chamber was so quiet that I could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the room. Chancellor Rethon spoke first. "Archivist Solon, you are telling us that a species we classified as Category 9, the lowest possible rating, has developed technology that exceeds our own and has been building a coalition against us for 3 centuries. Not against us, Chancellor. They have not taken any hostile action. They have not threatened us. They have not demanded anything. The coalition was not built to oppose us. It was built because we left a gap, and they filled it." "Semantics," growled a council member from the far end of the semicircle. "A coalition of that size, with that technology, positioned against our interests, is a threat, regardless of their stated intentions." Before I could respond, a signal officer entered the chamber. She moved quickly, her face tight with the kind of controlled urgency that told me something was wrong. She handed a data tablet to Chancellor Rethon and stepped back. Rethon read the tablet. I watched his face change. The lines deepened. The color shifted. Something moved behind his eyes that I had never seen there before, and it took me a moment to recognize it as fear. "A transmission has been received," he said, "from Earth, directed to this council, through our secure channels." A murmur went through the chamber. Our secure channels were encrypted with the most advanced algorithms the hegemony possessed. They were considered unbreakable, and yet a message from a planet we had forgotten had just arrived through them, like a letter slipped under a locked door. Rethon activated the transmission. A holographic image appeared in the center of the chamber. A human man, middle-aged, with steady eyes and a calm voice. His name, according to the identifier at the bottom of the transmission, was Edward Blake, Special Envoy of the Forgotten Alliance. "Honored Council of the Quenthari Hegemony," Edward Blake said. "On behalf of the Forgotten Alliance, representing 47 species across 212 star systems, I am formally requesting recognition of our coalition as a sovereign entity within the galactic community. We seek equal standing, mutual respect, and open dialogue. We do not seek conflict. We do not seek revenge. We seek only to be seen." The transmission continued for several minutes, outlining terms and proposals with the precision of a document that had been decades in the making. But I was not listening to the words anymore. I was watching the council. I was watching 12 of the most powerful beings in the hegemony realize, in real time, that the galaxy they thought they controlled had changed beneath their feet. Some of them looked angry. Some looked afraid. Most looked lost, as if the ground they had built their lives on had suddenly turned to water. Chancellor Rethon sat very still, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes fixed on the holographic image of a human who was calmly and politely informing the Quenthari hegemony that the age of their dominance was ending. When the transmission ended, the chamber descended into chaos. Council members spoke over each other, voices rising, arguments forming and fracturing in the span of seconds. Dremain's faction, the military hardliners, called for immediate defensive mobilization. The diplomatic wing called for negotiations. The economic advisors warned that any hostile response could collapse trade networks that were already straining. Chancellor Rethon raised his hand. The chamber fell silent. He looked at me. His old eyes found mine across the vast room, and in them I saw a question that he did not want to ask, but could not avoid any longer. "Archivist Solon, your original report classified the humans of Sol 3 as Category 9. Given everything you have presented today, what would you classify them as now?" I looked at the space where Edward Blake's image had hung. I thought about the orbital stations and the warships and the restored forests. I thought about dimensional folding and genetic engineering, and a coalition of 47 species that the hegemony had forgotten. I thought about Claire Ashton's laugh, and Simon Ward's steady handshake, and the look in Lucy Grant's eyes when she told me they had conquered the impossible. I would not classify them at all, I said. Our scale does not go high enough. The chamber erupted again, but I was done speaking. I had said everything I needed to say, and the truth of it was settling over the council like a weight that would never fully lift. We had forgotten about Earth, and Earth had not forgotten about us. 3 months passed after the council session, and the galaxy changed faster than anyone could have predicted. Not with a war, not with an invasion, not with the dramatic confrontation that Commander Drawn had spent his career preparing for. It changed with something far worse. It changed with a choice. The first defection came from a Quenthari mining colony in the outer systems. The colony had been operating for 2 centuries, extracting mineral resources from a world whose native species the hegemony had relocated to a reservation on the planet's smallest continent. When the Forgotten Alliance made formal contact with that native species and offered them membership, the colony's situation became untenable overnight. The natives filed a sovereignty claim backed by the full diplomatic and technological weight of 47 civilizations, and the hegemony could not challenge it without confirming every accusation the Alliance had ever made about us. 3 more colonies filed similar claims within the week, then 5 more, then a dozen. Each one followed the same pattern. The Alliance would contact a displaced or marginalized species, offer them support and membership, and the species would assert rights that the hegemony had never acknowledged because it had never needed to. The legal frameworks did not exist to handle these claims. The hegemony had no laws governing the rights of Category 9 species, because nobody had ever imagined that Category 9 species would have the power to demand them. I watched it happen from my office in the Grand Archive. I was still the senior archivist, technically, though my role had been quietly reduced to administrative duties after the council session. The high-ranking officials who controlled the archive were not interested in hearing more bad news, and I had become associated with the most catastrophic intelligence failure in the hegemony's history. Nobody blamed me directly. That would have required admitting that the failure was real. Instead, they simply stopped asking for my reports. But I kept reading, I kept monitoring, and what I saw, day after day, was the slow and irreversible unraveling of everything I had spent my life serving. The Forgotten Alliance did not attack the hegemony. They did not need to. They offered an alternative. And species after species, world after world, chose the alternative. The Alliance's technology was better. Their diplomatic approach was fairer. Where the hegemony ranked species and assigned value based on classification scores, the Alliance treated every member as an equal partner. Where the hegemony extracted resources and moved on, the Alliance invested in sustainable development. Where the hegemony cataloged and filed and forgot, the Alliance remembered. It was that last part that stung the most. The hegemony's entire identity was built on the archive, on the idea that we had preserved and organized the knowledge of the galaxy. But the truth was that we had never used that knowledge for anything except our own benefit. We collected it like trophies. The humans and their allies used it like tools, sharing it freely, building on it collectively, turning it into something that grew rather than gathered dust. The economic effects were devastating. Trade networks that had sustained the hegemony for centuries began to fracture as partners found better deals with Alliance members. Resource flows that had been stable for generations shifted as former Quenthari subject worlds redirected their output toward Alliance markets. The hegemony's currency, once the standard of galactic commerce, began to lose value against new exchange systems that the Alliance had introduced. I received reports from across the Empire. Governors wrote about declining revenues and population loss. Military commanders wrote about difficulty maintaining fleet readiness as supply chains deteriorated. Scientists wrote about colleagues leaving for Alliance institutions where funding was more generous and collaboration was more open. Commander Drawn did not take the changing situation well. He had returned from Earth convinced that the only appropriate response was military, and when the Council hesitated, he found others who shared his view. A hardliner faction formed around him, drawing support from military commanders and colonial administrators who saw their power slipping away and wanted to fight for it. 8 weeks after the council session, Dran led a strike force against a human outpost on the edge of Alliance territory. It was a small installation, a research station staffed by fewer than 200 humans and a handful of allied species. Dran's force included 3 cruisers and their support vessels. By any reasonable military calculation, the attack should have been swift and decisive. It lasted less than 4 minutes. The human defense systems activated before Dran's ships were within firing range. The outpost shields absorbed everything the cruisers could throw at them without showing any sign of strain. And then, without a single return shot being fired, the outpost's communication array broadcast a signal that shut down every offensive system on Dran's ships simultaneously. Weapons went offline. Targeting systems went dark. Engine power dropped to minimum. The cruisers were left floating in space, fully intact, completely unharmed, and utterly helpless. The humans did not retaliate with force. They did not need to. They broadcast footage of the entire engagement to every species in the galaxy, along with a calm statement from Edward Blake, expressing regret that the hegemony had chosen confrontation over dialogue. The footage showed Dran's ships firing on a station that did not fire back. It showed the humans calmly activating their defenses. It showed the moment the cruisers went silent, hanging in space like toys that someone had switched off. The message was clear without being spoken. The humans could have destroyed those ships. They had chosen not to. And they wanted everyone to see the difference between a civilization that reached for weapons and one that reached for solutions. Public opinion across the galaxy shifted overnight. Species that had been neutral or undecided in the dispute between the hegemony and the Alliance suddenly found their sympathies redirected. 4 more Quinthari subject worlds filed for independence within days. 2 major trade partners suspended negotiations indefinitely. The hegemony's reputation, already strained, crumbled like a wall that had been holding back water for too long. Dran was recalled and placed under review. I expected him to be angry. When I visited him in his quarters at the military compound, I found something worse. He was defeated, not just by the failed attack, but by the realization that everything he had trained for, everything he had believed about the relationship between strength and power, was wrong. They could have destroyed my ships, he said, sitting in the half-darkness of his room, his uniform hanging loose on his frame as if he had shrunk inside it. They had the capability. I have reviewed the engagement data. Their defense systems could have eliminated all 3 cruisers in seconds, but they chose not to. They chose to embarrass us instead. He looked up at me with eyes that had lost their sharpness. How do you fight a species that does not need to hurt you to defeat you? I did not have an answer. But the question haunted me long after I left his quarters. Keth resigned from the survey division the following week. He did not join the Alliance or leave Quinthari space. He transferred to a civilian transport company and started flying cargo routes between outer colonies. When I asked him why, he said he needed time to think, and that it was easier to think when he was moving. I understood. The 4 of us who had gone to Earth had each been changed by what we saw, and we were each processing it in our own way. Dran through anger and defeat, Imari through curiosity and escape, Keth through motion and distance, and me through the slow, painful recognition that the institution I had served my whole life was not what I had believed it to be. The weeks that followed brought more changes. The Grand Archive received resignation notices from staff members who had accepted positions at Alliance institutions. Some of them were among our best researchers, scientists who had spent decades in the hegemony's service and now saw better opportunities elsewhere. They were not leaving in anger. They were not making political statements. They were leaving because the Alliance offered them something the hegemony could not: the chance to work on problems that mattered, alongside partners who valued their contributions, in an environment where curiosity was rewarded rather than managed. Inamari was among them. I received her resignation with a heaviness that surprised me. Of all my crew, she had always been the one who most clearly saw the world as it was, rather than as she wanted it to be. Her letter was brief and respectful. Archivist Solon, it read, I have accepted a research fellowship at a human university on their Pacific coast. The program is interdisciplinary, combining xenobiology with ecological engineering, and it will allow me to continue the work I began on Earth. I want you to know that my decision is not a rejection of the hegemony or of my time serving with you. It is simply a recognition that the universe is larger than the archive, and that there are better ways to understand it than by filing it away. I hope you will consider visiting. The campus is beautiful, and the humans have a tradition called office hours, where anyone can walk in and ask questions about anything. They do not check your classification first. With respect and gratitude, Imari. She sent a second message 3 weeks later, shorter and more personal. They do not put us in a file and forget about us. They ask us what we want to learn. That sentence stayed with me. It circled in my mind during the long nights when I sat alone in my office, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that was slowly losing its relevance. The archive was vast. It contained the records of 12,000 species across 1,000 star systems. It was the greatest repository of information in the galaxy. And yet, as I sat there among its shelves and its screens and its endless data, I realized that it was missing the one thing that mattered most. It did not contain understanding. It contained facts, classifications, categories, and rankings. It contained the measurements of a galaxy reduced to numbers, but it did not understand anything about the beings it had measured. It had looked at the humans of Sol 3 and seen primitive creatures with short lives and fragile bodies. It had never asked what they dreamed about. It had never wondered what they might become. It had never considered that the small, fragile creature banging rocks by a river might be looking up at the stars and imagining a future that the archive could not predict. I thought about Keth's question. Are we the villains? I still did not know the answer, but I was beginning to understand that the question itself was wrong. This was not a story about villains and heroes. It was a story about a civilization that had been so certain of its own superiority that it had stopped looking, stopped wondering, stopped imagining that anything new was possible. And in the silence of that certainty, something extraordinary had grown. I made my decision on a quiet evening, sitting alone in the archive after the other staff had gone home. The building was empty, the lights were dim. The silence was so deep that I could hear the faint hum of the data storage systems running in the lower levels, preserving information that fewer and fewer people cared about. I accessed the Earth file one last time. I navigated through layers of data, past the orbital surveys and the atmospheric readings and the biological assessments, until I reached the original classification summary. The same words that had been there for 10,000 years, unchanged, unchallenged, accepted as truth by every archivist who had ever opened this file. Sol 3, dominant species, bipedal mammalian, intelligence, emergent, tool use, rudimentary, threat assessment, none, recommendation, no further observation required. I stared at those words for a long time. I thought about the scientist who had written them, 10,000 years ago. She had probably spent less than an hour on the report. She had looked at the data, assigned the numbers, and moved on to the next world. She had not been careless or malicious. She had simply been doing her job, working within a system that told her some things were worth her attention and others were not. Then I opened the amendment field and began to type. I did not write a long entry. I did not correct the classification, or update the threat assessment, or revise the recommendations. Those things were beyond correction. The entire framework was flawed, and no amendment could fix a system that was built on the assumption that some beings were worth less than others. Instead, I wrote 3 words. 3 words that I hoped, someday, someone would read and understand. We were wrong. I saved the amendment. I closed the file. I stood up, pushed in my chair, and walked out of the Grand Archive for the last time. My footsteps echoed in the empty halls, past the rows of data terminals, past the portraits of former chief archivists who looked down at me with painted expressions of certainty that I could no longer share. The transit hub was quiet at that hour. I booked passage on a long-range transport heading outward, toward the frontier systems, where Alliance and Hegemony territory overlapped. From there, I would find a connection to Sol space. I was not sure how long the journey would take. I was not sure what I would do when I arrived. I was not an ambassador. I was not a scientist. I was not a diplomat. I was an archivist who had spent her entire career organizing information about a galaxy she had never truly understood. But Imari had written that the humans had a tradition of office hours, that anyone could walk in and ask questions, that they did not check your classification first. I had a lot of questions. I packed a single bag. I left my hegemony credentials on my desk. I did not file a resignation. I did not notify anyone. I simply left, the way the humans had simply grown, without asking permission, without waiting for approval, without caring whether the archive had a category for what they were doing. On my way out of the building, I passed the night custodian, an elderly Quinthari named Seven, who had cleaned the archive for longer than I had worked there. He looked at my bag and then at my face. "Going somewhere, archivist?" he asked. "Somewhere new," I said. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I had said. "Good," he replied. "This place could use a few people who are willing to go somewhere new." I walked out into the cool evening air and crossed the plaza toward the transit hub. The city hummed around me with the sounds of a civilization that was still functioning, still going about its daily business, but beneath the familiar rhythm, I could feel the uncertainty. People moved a little faster than they used to. Conversations were a little quieter. The news broadcasts that played on public screens carried headlines about alliance expansion and trade disruptions, and the faces of the commentators wore expressions of confusion that they tried to disguise as analysis. The hegemony was not dying, not yet, but it was being asked a question that it had never been forced to answer before, not by an enemy, but by an alternative. Not by a species that wanted to tear it down, but by a coalition that had built something better and was simply inviting the galaxy to come and see. The transport lifted off from Kenthar Prime as the planet's sun was setting. Through the window, I watched the capital city shrink beneath me, its spires and towers catching the last light, the grand archive standing at its center like a monument to a way of thinking that was already becoming history. It was still beautiful. It would always be beautiful. But beauty was not enough to sustain something that had forgotten how to grow. And then I turned away from the window and looked forward, toward the darkness of open space, and somewhere beyond it, the light of a small yellow sun that I had never paid attention to before. The hegemony had an old saying. It was carved into the entrance of the Grand Archive, etched in stone by the founders of our civilization thousands of years ago. What grows in the dark never grows tall. It was meant as a warning, a reminder that knowledge must be shared and preserved to have value, that things hidden and forgotten will wither and die. But the humans had grown in the dark. We had forgotten them, abandoned them, left them in the shadow of our indifference for 10,000 years. And they had not withered, they had not died, they had grown taller than all of us. They had reached out from their small blue world and lifted up every other forgotten thing they could find. And they had done it without rage, without revenge, without the need to tear us down in order to build themselves up. That was the part that haunted me most. That was the part that I knew would keep the council awake at night and would eventually force the hegemony to choose between change and collapse. And that, in the end, was far harder to fight than any weapon ever built. The transport entered faster than light travel, and the stars stretched into lines of light across my window. Somewhere ahead, Earth was waiting. A planet I had once dismissed as irrelevant. A species I had once classified as primitive. A world that had proven, beyond any possible argument, that the greatest mistake you can make is to look at something small and fragile and assume it will stay that way forever. I settled into my seat. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Not the arrogant hope of a Quenthari official who believed the future would look like the past. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to a sinking ship. A different kind of hope, the quiet, steady kind that comes from watching something broken begin to heal, from seeing a better way forward and choosing to walk toward it, even when the path is unfamiliar and the destination is uncertain. The humans had shown me that hope, not through speeches or declarations, but through the simple, overwhelming evidence of what they had built. A world that breathed, a coalition that cared, a future that had room for everyone, even the ones who had once tried to classify them and put them in a box. I did not know what I would find when I reached Earth. I did not know if they would welcome me or question my motives or turn me away. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that the archive had once given me about the wrong things, and that the humans had now given me about the right ones. The galaxy was bigger than any file could hold. The future was stranger than any classification could predict, and the small, fragile, impossibly stubborn creatures on Sol 3 had been trying to tell us that since the day we first looked down at them from orbit and decided they were nothing. We should have listened.